dig into Contrast report on cyber bank heists, where we'll be looking at all manner of e-fraud. And please do jump in. We have remarkable guests on today. Don't be shy. This is your chance to ask them hard questions. They specifically said, please give us hard questions. So to kick it off, please let us know where you're joining us from in the chat window. I'm in Boston. Fortunately, the Arctic blast is no longer blasting, but I'm still cold, so I might do that. Anyway, if you let us know where you're from, we promise not to show up on your doorstep, even though we are on today with a member of the Secret Service. Anyway, for the next hour or so, we're going to talk about this report, which we've been working on for months here at Contrast. The Cyber Bank Heist report lays out the cybersecurity threats that are facing the financial sector. So these issues are what financial sector security leaders from around the world have been seeing over the past year, vis-a-vis cyber attack trends, new forms of e-fraud, which attacks worry them the most, and how they're shifting their security strategy to deal. So, since last year's edition of the Bank Heist report, the threat landscape has been blitzkrieged by rising geopolitical tension, particularly given the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the related cyber war that's broken out. Attacks have also gotten nasty and punitive. The attackers really want to drag companies' reputations through the dirt and destroy all their data instead of just encrypting it. So this is the 6th edition of the report. And today we've lined up the author himself to talk about it. He's Tom Kellermann, Contrast's Senior VP of Cyber Strategy. He is the guy behind the entire 6-report series. We're also ecstatic about having successfully talked to Derek Booth into coming on today. Derek, who wrote the report's foreword, is assistant to the special agent in charge with the U.S. Secret Service and head of the Mountain West Cyber Fraud Task Force. Respect to you both. I'm going to try out my Nicolas Cage impression here. Respect to you both. So Tom, why don't you kick us off with a bit about your background and what inspired you to launch this series?
Yeah, 24 years ago, I began my work in cybersecurity at the World Bank Treasury security team. And I wrote the first ever book on the state of play of electronic safety and soundness and threats to the financial sector. This is back when the World Bank was connecting all the central banks of the world to the internet to improve liquidity and to manifest electronic finance. Little did they know at the time that public key infrastructure and encryption wouldn't save them from what we see today. 6 years ago, I re-engaged with that passion because I think most of us appreciate that the financial sector is the most secure, but at the same time, they're facing the most organized and sophisticated adversaries, cybercrime cartels, and spies in the world. And so we can learn a lot from them. And more importantly, we can allow for offense to inform our defensive posture.
Yeah, and we're going to be diving into kind of exactly what are the evolving threats facing this sector, but these are relevant to pretty much any sector, right?
They are. And, the banks, again, spend the most on cybersecurity, have some of the most sophisticated teams, have employed some of the best countermeasures and defenses and controls. But that being said, they're still dealing with cybercrime conspiracies. They're still suffering from the destructive attack. And most importantly, they're realizing there's new forms of fraud that are manifesting. And more often than not, the adversary is trying to hijack their environments. And so there's a lot to be learned from where the banks have gotten it right and where they've gotten it wrong and where they stand in the future and what their strategies might be. But more importantly, Derek works with financial institutions all the time. Most of you may or may not know that Secret Service are responsible for protecting the financial sector. They began in the Treasury Department after the Civil War. And Derek, I'll hand it off to you for perspective on that.
Yeah, well, I did want to know how you got into the cybersecurity ranks of the Secret Service, Derek. And also, while you're at it, let us know how you two know each other.
No, I appreciate it, Lisa. And Tom, thank you so much for letting me be here. So I've been a part of the Secret Service for almost 24 years. I started the job back in New Haven, Connecticut, back in 1999. And I did the first 10 years, I did what most Secret Service agents do, and that's protect people. And then in 2012, I went to computer forensics school, and that started a whole new world for me. And it opened up all kinds of doors and all kinds of information that I had no idea existed. And the minute I put my shingle out here in the Denver office, I started examining computers and cell phones and skimmers and all that. But then that quickly evolved into network intrusion, incident response, ransomware, business email compromise attacks, all the things we're going to talk about today. And at times it's overwhelming because there's so much of it and it's changing so much. I gave a presentation just last week and I talked about in 1999 what we concentrated on, and that was credit card fraud and check fraud and counterfeit money still back then. And now today, if you go back to headquarters, we have so many people diving into what we call the GIOC, the Global Investigative Operations Center, our cyber fraud threat intelligence section, cyber intelligence section. And we're sending a lot of people through training. I have one of my agents today, he's at network intrusion training today to become a responder to incident response. And it's crazy, just the way it's changed and how fast it's changing. And then about a year ago, to answer your question, Lisa, I became the coordinator for the Mountain West Cyber Fraud Task Force. And what that is, that's about 250 members in the Denver or the Colorado, Wyoming, Utah and Idaho states. And that's private partners as well as law enforcement partners, state, local, and federal. And we're just trying to help each other out, do what we can. And Tom is a great part of that. He's very generous. Tom's been a part of our task force for a few years now. I've known him very well for the last couple of years. And just to give an example, just this last year when I took over, the very first question out of his mouth was, what can I do to help your team? And he provided a full day of training of advanced incident response to a bunch of detectives and investigators, forensic examiners here in our office. And it was great. And it was awesome. So yeah, Tom's a great member, and he's on our steering committee and our task force. So he helps us decide what we're going to attack and what we're going to talk about. And our next in-person meeting, Tom's actually going to present this report we're going to talk about today. So we'll have even more chance to hash on him and to hound on him a little bit on some of his findings.
Awesome. Well, today's our chance to hound on him, to hound on both of these guys. So before we dive into the specifics of what the report found, listeners, make sure that you get what you came for. Before we dive into these questions that we've set up, what do you want to ask about attack trends in the financial sector? Drop your questions into chat and they'll get funneled over to us. So, Tom, this is the 6th report in the series. What surprised you, if anything, when you were doing the research for this latest edition?
From the perspective of attack trends, I think notably it's important to appreciate that island hopping is continuing. So you have to remember that the name of the game has changed. The adversary wants to hijack your digital transformation and then use your environment to attack your constituency. The burglary has become more of a hostage situation. And so just because you may not consider yourself part of the supply chain and you're victimized by a supply chain attack, doesn't mean they're not going to use your environment to attack your constituency. That's increasing more often than not. Coupled with that is destructive attacks are surging. More often than not, they're being used as part of counter-incident response to punish the defender for reacting to them, whether they're deploying wipers in the environment. I mean, there have been 12 new wipers released into the wild since the January 13th of last year. Largely in part due to the Ukrainian conflict and war. But many cybercrime cartels also use those same wipers. In addition, they could attack you with, ransomware, not Petya style, where they don't actually ask for a ransom, they just try to cripple you as a defender. So whether or not it's part of counter-incident response or whether it's part of geopolitical tension is irrelevant, but destructive attacks are here to stay. And I think notably, not only obviously are application attacks surging, I don't need to say that to you. You all read the Verizon data breach report. It's the #1 attack vector of choice, but they're becoming more sophisticated. The injection attacks out there are becoming much more prolific, much more widespread, but also in the same vein, adversaries are targeting APIs, and they're targeting APIs because they've become the new perimeter. I mean, there's 200 million APIs out there. No one really knows where they end and begin. And you see adversaries using that beachhead of the API to attack the greater ecosystem of the victim.
Mm-hmm. Well, Derek, how about you? How well does the report portray the threats that banks and financial institutions are grappling with right now from where you sit in the Secret Service?
No, so it's a very interesting report. And Tom talks a lot about the spear phishing and business email compromise attacks, which are still, I think are definitely our #1 hit still. IC3 report last year said $2.4 billion were lost just in BEC attacks. And that is becoming a huge problem. And it makes sense. That's where the money is, right? The money's in the banks, in the financial institutions. So the threat actors are going after that money. And what a better way than to get in, manipulate the email systems, forwarding rules, the things that they can touch, and start sending out these bogus emails, and then collecting on the fruits of their labors. Right? They're conning executives, they're conning account managers, you name it, that are busy, they're stressed out. And so the bad guy plays on that. He plays on human emotion. He knows on Friday afternoon, these people are scrambling. And at the end of the month, if I throw some nice emails at them and get them to, send some wires, I've got a whole weekend to play with that before they even realize what hit them. So that's definitely what we're seeing. We're seeing the BEC attacks in a much greater level. There's so many other scams out there. The phishing definitely starts pretty much all of them. I was just going through our network intrusion incident report database this week, and just besides the BEC attacks, we got account takeovers, we've got SIM swapping, when somebody social engineers your cell phone records and your account and gets a hold of your cell phone. Now they can help, they can take over. And then when you're talking about multi-factor authentication, they own that too. And so they can get into your accounts that way. Another small one that hits a lot of people. One of my neighbors got this just the other day, selling, he sold something on eBay or Craigslist. And when the bad guy shows up, he pays him, instead of $100, he pays him $1,000. And then tries to con my friend into sending that $900 difference somewhere else. And that's a small way they're starting to hit people and companies. They're doing it to companies as well as individuals. So it's very interesting data, and it's amazing where we're going, where we are.
Well, Derek, let me ask you, in the lead up to this, Tom was suggesting that we talk about check kiting, that you talk about that. And I'm not super familiar with check kiting. Do you want to give us an overview of what you're seeing there?
So it's interesting. When I came on the job, check kiting was true check kiting. Bad guy would take, legitimate check and just counterfeit it off a printer, off a scanner, or they would con the bank into sending them a new check in the bad guy's name. And then they would go out and one of my favorite cases in New Haven was a guy that went around to jewelry stores and would talk the young kids off the streets, and they would go in and buy $8,000 worth of jewelry and then go out and sell it on the street. That has evolved now, but it's still the same principles. They're able to social engineer you as the victim or the bank into sending and into giving it account records or account control, to the bad guy. One of the ways they do that is, again, through spear phishing or even smishing, right? They'll send a text message to you pretending that they're, Wells Fargo or Zelle or PayPal or whoever it might be, and say, hey, we have, you have records or you have an account. We need to verify that account. Is this legitimate? And then when the victim calls that number or responds, they're going to get somebody on the other end that's going to talk them, sweetly, kindly, nicely, and con them into giving control, and then either sending them money or giving, most importantly, control of their account. So that's probably one of the biggest ways in today's world. We see it a lot, especially with the elderly. Elderly seem to fall for that, quite honestly. Also the lonely, widows, widowers, they're lonely. They want a friend. And then the elderly, they want to do the right thing. So they're trying to help out who they think is a poor victim. And in all honesty, they're going to become the victim really quick. And so that's really what we're seeing in today's world right now. And again, we could talk about 1,000 different scams out there, but those are some of the examples.
Before we move on though, Derek, and thank you so much for that overview of what you're seeing. But you had mentioned something about they're taking over multi-factor authentication. That's sending shivers down my spine. Of course, I mean, that's has been the holy grail for protection. But
Sure.
What do you mean that they're taking over MFA?
So if they can get a hold of your cell phone account, now they've got your account. And so most people use that cell phone account as that multi-factor authentication. So if they can swap over, we call it SIM swapping. You go buy a new SIM and you either con, the provider, whether it's like Verizon or AT&T, into swapping over that account, or you somehow get the victim online and you pretend you're Verizon or AT&T, and you con the victim into turning over account records. And they usually do it by saying, hey, we need just to verify. that's kind of a key thing. We're, you know,
They can do that over text, right, Derek? They can just send you a text message and it looks legit.
Yeah, typically text, because that's the way you're going to talk with your cell phone, right? Most people communicate that way. And then once you turn that account over, or if you give that account over, now they've got you, and now they've got a hold of your cell phone records, your cell phone number, and then they've got your account. And so it's a scary thought, and it's causing huge dollar losses right now.
Well, let's drill down into some of the report's findings. One of the biggest takeaways was that 60% of financial institutions that participated in the research have been victimized by attacks on their integrity and or destructive attacks, these wiper attacks that we've been referring to. Now, these attacks are launched as punishments for organizations that dare to fight back, as I understand it. They're just meant to destroy data, not to encrypt it. Why are they getting so vicious? What's the point in this for them? If they aren't even bothering to make a profit by encrypting data with ransomware, they're instead choosing to shame or to firebomb organizations. I guess you call it e-firebombing. What's the point of that?
The point is one of two reasons. They're punishing financial institutions that have participated or have been compliant with economic sanctions against countries like Russia for the war. And so as a result of the economic sanctions that were leveraged and imposed by the banks against them, they punish the institution for complying with that mandate. Or they punish the defender, the security professionals, for responding to them. And this really underscores that we have to change the way in which we conduct incident response and threat hunting. We can't be as loud as we used to be. Metaphorically, we can't shout out when someone breaks into the house, "I have a gun, I've called the cops, get out of my house." You're making assumptions. You're making an assumption that it's one adversary. You're making an assumption that adversary is going to flee, and you're making the assumption that that adversary isn't willing to burn your house down with you in it to punish you for calling the police. And so how we conduct incident response must change. We must become much more clandestine in how we conduct incident response. We need better built-in detection and response capabilities that extend across from the network to the endpoints. We shouldn't necessarily terminate command and control immediately when we identify an adversary or a backdoor, because you're making the assumption that there isn't a secondary C2 on a sleep cycle. And we should maybe just have our agents, our security capabilities, agents in monitor-only mode while we gather all the relevant telemetry associated with the breach or the intrusions prior to acting, because that's the nature of the game we face today. The adversary is willing to escalate. You don't necessarily want them to know that you're on to them.
It sounds like something that we should go study pen testing best practices for, but I don't know. Well, Tom, respondents said that they fear Russia the most. Is this warranted, and why or why not?
From the perspective of the financial sector, it's warranted, because the original, Dillingers of cyberspace that kind of manifested in 1995 when money became digital, all right, and straight through processing became relevant, e-finance became a thing. Were Russian speaking. The original cyber criminals, the original dark web infrastructure was Russian, and they were successfully targeting financial institutions for a long time as criminals. Only after 2013 did the cyber criminals and cyber cartels of Russia begin to collude with the regime under the auspices of the Gerasimov Doctrine to act as patriotic militias. And that became a reality more so, during the invasion of Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. But, Chinese hackers don't really focus their attentions on banks for a couple of great reasons. They own a large percentage of the major banks. They have much more control of their underground hacker communities, for example, and et cetera, et cetera. I can go down the list. And then also as it relates to just this functional reality that the subculture of the dark web, specific to the Russian-speaking dark web, which I would say consists of like 60% of the proceeds of the larger economy of scale, is very much focused on this gangster-like mentality of pillaging the environment and punishing the defender.
Yeah. Okay. Well, how can we even tell where the attacks originate, given that I think you've mentioned that the criminals are in the habit of using Western proxies to hide their tracks?
Attribution is incredibly difficult in general. Again, to the reality of this report, the majority of the CISOs who were interviewed for this report were most concerned with the Russian organized cybercrime cartels. I think it's just more important to underscore that the most sophisticated and organized criminal groups in the dark web are Russian speaking, period. Whether they actually live in Russia or Eastern Europe is irrelevant. There have been a number of fantastic cyber criminals out of Romania and out of Ukraine, and Derek can speak to many of these investigations, but the true untouchables from Western law enforcement, those who have enjoyed the protection racket from the West, those folks are living in Russia and they enjoy that protection racket so long as they act out in a patriotic fashion.
Mm-hmm. Derek, do you want to contribute anything to what Tom has to say about the whole Russian threat?
Well, I'll just add, I mean, those stats don't lie. And for sure, I mean, the Russians are at the top of the list. BEC attacks, we keep going back to that. I apologize, but the number, the dollar amounts there are going down to Hong Kong, Malaysia, and China. So can't forget about them, but then also can't forget about North Korea as well. North Koreans definitely they've got their fingers in this. And you asked, I asked earlier, why do they do that? I think they're patriotic. I think that they don't like North America. They don't like the UK. And if you look at the number of incidents that are involved, the US is at the top, UK is second, and then everybody else is kind of there behind. And Canada kind of leads that group at the top of that. But so I think they're more patriotic than anything. And as Tom said, they want money, number one. And then, we had intelligence come out yesterday through Verizon that they've connected a lot of these cyber criminal gangs with the Russian intelligence services. So that's definitely good intelligence. And if you look at the victims and the number of incidents, that's definitely who they're attacking.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you for that. Let's look at something that I thought was a bit positive out of the report, namely that we've tracked a drop. Tom, you've tracked a drop in ransomware attacks on financial institutions over the past year. Mind you, those attacks are still coming in fast and furious. 40% of financial institutions said that they have been victimized, but 40%, that's a big drop from a year prior when 74% reported getting hit by one or more ransomware attacks. Derek, do you agree that you're seeing fewer ransomware attacks in the financial sector?
I do agree. Not to diminish the ransomware attacks, because once they go out to somewhere else, the impact is huge. But we're seeing a lot more of those ransomware attacks in the healthcare facilities and municipalities. We've had a string of them here in the Colorado area alone with municipalities, and it makes total sense to me, because you're going to hit a financial institution when you want some easy cash, when you want the quick cash, right? And that's your account takeovers, that's your injections, that's your BEC attacks, and then you're going to go out to gather. You're going to make the world panic with the ransomware, and that's what they're doing. They're hitting companies and municipalities that provide life, right? You're providing healthcare services, you're providing power, water, whatever, police and fire services, and that just causes a panic. And what those locations, what those entities have to offer is PII, is personal information. And so if you can make somebody panic with that ransomware attack, and you put them in that world, they're gonna pay that money. They're gonna pay the millions of dollars out there that the threat actors want. So it makes sense to me. And to answer your question, yeah, we've seen a definite drop in the ransomware attacks in the financial institution world, but it's pivoting to everywhere else. It's pivoting to these other organizations, which to me is a scary thought.
Well, I would like to add one thing there. I completely agree. But also from a defensive countermeasure perspective, I think the financial institutions have gotten a lot better, particularly with integration of their network detection response capabilities, with their endpoint detection response capabilities, their time to remediation. They're decreasing dwell time of the adversary and the infrastructure. They're also fully cognizant that the majority of ransomware attacks, the vector of choice is through a previously compromised host. So they buy access, or they are provided access to a previously compromised system by these these nefarious folks called access brokers who then deploy the ransomware in the system. And so the banks are better at finding those backdoors, those remote access Trojans, those C2s on sleep cycles than others because of much more informed threat hunting, number one. Number two, I tip my hat to the efforts of the Secret Service, the FBI, the NSA, for unprecedented declassification and sharing of telemetry and TTPs associated with these groups and these capabilities, as well as encryption keys, frankly, coupled with, finally, thank you, the federal government's taking the gloves off. They're actively hacking into and disrupting the forums associated with these crews so that these folks are forced to play defense, as illustrated just last week and previously before that. And so I tip my hat to the efforts of the feds in this regard, but also I would say that the banks have done a much better job of identifying that backdoor that is typically the attack vector for the ransom.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, Tom, because beyond giving kudos to the feds, you've credited coordinated international law enforcement efforts with dismantling the infrastructure used by ransomware gangs. Derek, what do you think of those efforts? Have you seen law enforcement cracking the code when it comes to how ransomware works as a business? Is it enough, not enough, a learning process, or what?
So it's definitely a learning process, and it's definitely a team effort. And the Secret Service is very aggressive in these type of attacks. We're also very aggressive in trying to build relationships. That's one thing the Secret Service does very well, is we work in a counterpart system in almost every single thing we do, especially protection, but then it carries over in investigations. We have working groups in London, in Interpol, Europol. We had a working group in the Ukraine. I believe we still have one in Peru. And then we have these great relationships through our cyber fraud task force that Tom mentioned earlier. And that's one thing we try to do, is just, we want to know who to call, who's the expert in dealing with this. You know, Europol has a great, their campaign that I'm drawing a blank now, nomoreransomware.org. And then CISA also has their stopransomware.org campaigns. And part of Europol's group is they're actually providing the decryption codes and the keys to stopping those attacks that have already happened, but then future attacks, but then just the sharing of information, and then the partnerships. Again, here in just in Denver, just a small example, we work with CISA, the FBI, the Colorado OIT's office. We try to build those relationships so that when we do have an attack, and we had one back in August here locally, we had all of those entities were there helping each other. And then not even a week later, we had another municipality get hit with ransomware here. It was the exact same strain, the exact same everything. So we could just make a couple phone calls, and the guys they've already got a leg up on what they're attacking. So I agree that, but at the same time, we're struggling. I mean, it's the millions of dollars that are happening, and the poor victims that are out there. We're playing catch up. And I read a great article yesterday, and I can't remember where I read it, but I shouldn't even reference it, but it did say that cybercrime is the third greatest economy in the universe, next to us and China. And wow. I thought, wow, that's and it estimated that we would go to $8 trillion, something like that, in $8 billion, I think, by 2024. And I apologize, I just threw that out there without giving you a reference, but it's a big number, and so that's what we're trying to do. And so I think the efforts are great, partnerships are great, and that's where I put my faith.
Oh, those numbers are jaw-dropping, but speak to the payment systems. I mean, part of the international efforts are all of this coordination, this excellent coordination, is to dismantle the payment systems that ransomware runs on. I mean, how's that going? How does that even work?
Derek, I'll turn to you on that one. So really, the cyber money laundering, the virtual currencies associated that are complicit in these endeavors, aside from them having their own challenges with their own security posture and being robbed by the North Koreans on a regular basis, are there known bad actors, Derek, of specific exchanges? You don't need to name them here, or takedowns of exchanges or currencies that pressure was put on them.
So there are, yeah. And I'll be honest, I don't have a ton of that information with me. I do know our experts in the GIOC, I referred to them earlier, the Global Investigative Operations Center back in Washington, D.C., is run by some great experts, guys and girls that dive into that kind of those kind of attack vectors, and they chase that money. and they've shut down exchanges. We have a money hunting crew that does exactly that. So if an agent in Omaha, Nebraska, or Salt Lake City, Utah has a question, we can go to the experts that are doing that every day. And they are, again, going back to those partnerships, they're building that with these crypto exchanges. They've identified, the players. We've had players come through Denver, where our offices around the country hit us up. We've interviewed them. We've taken electronics from them and done exams, and just trying to do any little thing to move that ball forward. And so it is happening. It's happening slowly. We could always do more. And I think, reports like Tom's here is fantastic, because it's getting those financial institutions on board. And we're seeing some definite results from their efforts.
Oh, excellent.
Lisa, one last point I think should be made here. It's quite ironic that, the original virtual currency of the world, the primary user group that embraced it, the first adopters were cyber criminals, right? Just a fact. It's a fact. And as we continue to realize that this is nefarious world, and many of these exchanges of virtual currencies do not want to be regulated. At the same time, they themselves deal with the manifestations of cyber crime. And in large part, they're vulnerable because they assume blockchain will secure them from the realities of cybercrime. And in the absence of proper application security and API security, they themselves can also be victimized on a continuous basis. And one country that really truly builds their missile program off of this is North Korea. They love targeting these exchanges, these virtual currencies, et cetera, because of the fact that they exist in that gray world.
Yeah, good source of income if you can crack it. Great. Well, thank you all for that. So when it comes to let's go back to the dip in ransomware attacks. We've been giving credit, well-deserved credit, to law enforcement. What about banks themselves, financial institutions? They're playing a part. You referred to EDR and other technologies that are helping, but what else are the financial institutions getting right?
Like I said, we need to remember that the majority of ransomware that is deployed in environments is deployed via a rat or previously compromised host in that environment that has been leveraged by the ecosystem, by the partnerships of the dark web and the cybercrime cartels. So when you conduct robust and systemic threat hunting, you will identify those secret passageways prior to them being exploited. Secondarily, a lot of ransomware is deployed through CVEs, through 0 days and other things. And so the financial institutions are doing a better job of implementing things like runtime protection, as well as, really systemically improving their capacity to harden their infrastructure from exposed vulnerabilities that could be used to launch those attacks in their environment.
Runtime protection. So we're talking about RASP, runtime application security protection. Yeah. What is a single thing that banks most need to get right? Is there any single thing that we can point to?
Well, I just want to talk to an e-fraud trend that really underscores this need for us to continuously evolve how we defend. So the number one takeaway from me, which was quite shocking again for the second year, was that the majority of the institutions realized that the adversaries were targeting non-public market information on their systems within their infrastructure. They weren't just going after wire transfer fraud. They weren't just going after PII. They wanted, material, non-public market information that could be used to conduct digital front running, digital insider trading, et cetera. That shows their level of knowledge and sophistication of the financial sector. So given you're dealing with an adversary that wants to maintain persistence on your system so that they can maintain omniscience of what's occurring on the system, it's an imperative that you have the capacity to defend your environment in real time and defend from within. So I think there's a number of countermeasures that should be employed beyond, implementation of things like XDR and runtime protection, all the way through, micro segmentation and doing other things. But there's a fundamental governance shift that has to occur. The two worst findings in this report, and I'll say it, the worst findings to me were the fact that CISOs are still reporting to CIOs. Defensive coordinators were still reporting to offensive coordinators. They still hadn't been empowered. And that is highly problematic if you think about the mindset that's necessitated and the fact that sometimes you have to tell the CIO no. That's going to increase the attack surface. That new application without let's say runtime protection, will be a massive exposure for us for infiltration or the theft of funds. And the other part is, some of these institutions, I think it was less than 30%, but still fairly large percentage, added cybersecurity specialists to their boards. And as much as you see the SEC and other regulators moving in that direction, and I think the SEC's updated guidance is coming out soon on reporting requirements, et cetera, as well as the need for that position on the board. I think hopefully we're taking a turn, we're turning the corner here, so that from a governance perspective, institutions no longer look at cybersecurity as an expense, but rather a functionality of conducting business and maintaining safety and soundness.
Okay, so thanks for getting into the governance side of this and the coming requirements to have cybersecurity smarts on the board. Let's get back into the nitty-gritty a little bit. We've got a question from a software analyst, Tom Henderson. He asks, from the coder side, how can developers curate external APIs used in software needing serverless functions as a service and the safety of other external processing sites? Those are a lot of words. I can say it again more slowly, but it's got to do with application programming interfaces and how do you curate those APIs? I mean, they're exploding, their proliferation is run amok. So, and it's got a lot to do, as Tom said, it's got to do with serverless, the rise of serverless, functions as a service, external processing sites. What are your ideas on that, Tom?
Yes, serverless security is here to stay. Obviously, Contrast has a capability that would endow you with the capacity to do just that, but there are limitations. The limitations are, you can expose that, you can have that situational awareness per your own environment, but at what point and how do you extend that beyond your environment? Like, where do you end and begin as it relates to what kind of shared service providers you use? I think the most important point to be made here is that you can't necessarily rely on the public cloud providers to secure your environment. And you yourself have to be much more responsible as it relates to how you protect the serverless environment, but also how you maintain situational awareness and the proper configurations in that environment in an automated fashion. But understanding exactly what your information supply chain looks like prior to engaging with a capability like our own, I think would be fundamental to your success.
And I think it's an ongoing issue. I mean, we've done a lot of delving into API security at Contrast, and it just seems like the feedback is like nobody cares about it that much, or maybe it's too new or something, but it's not getting the attention it seems to deserve. Comments on that are welcome. But let's look at some more specific attacks. The report noted spikes in watering hole attacks, application attacks, and island hopping attacks. Derek, let me ask you, you just spoke of BEC, but based on what you see, where should the sector really be focusing its defensive efforts? Everywhere? All of the above? What are some best practices there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And definitely the answer is all of the above. Reading Tom's report, I think the one thing that stood out to me was the watering hole attacks and the difference that can make for not only financial institutions, but for everybody. We do have a lot of mom and pop shops, smaller companies, smaller businesses that fall for that constantly. They'll go to a website, they think they're ordering supplies or they're the things that they're going to sell, and the next thing you know, they're out $5,000, $100,000 in bogus goods, and they've sent the money and it's gone. So I think the list that you sent there, I would say those watering hole attacks. But at the same time, I feel guilty if I don't go back to ransomware, because I think that's going to become a monster, in the future for, again, these municipalities, the non-financial institution entities. So I almost feel guilty if I don't mention that as well. But yeah, I'd say watering hole is the one that stood out to me.
And the thing about watering hole attacks that we need to appreciate here is they're not limited to the website. They extend to your mobile application that you have developed to provide goods and services to your clientele. In the absence of robust application security, in the absence of continuous monitoring of your development environment and production environments as it relates to that functionality, you're kind of flying blind as it relates to how those things can get polluted and how your legitimate website and or app is now being used as an island hop, as a watering hole to attack your constituency.
Well, when it comes to like concentrating your defenses, we've got another question. Are there any general rules that helps developers make these choices?
I mean, rules, I think, again, offense should inform defense. So again, I'm a huge proponent. One of the reasons why I'm here at Contrast is because of Jeff Williams, one of the founders of OWASP and the founders of Contrast. I think understanding how those attacks are viable against your environment, against your code base, really understanding what libraries are in use when you're developing code, understanding runtime reality, and understanding exactly how that operates and what vulnerabilities exist. Are of paramount importance. There are entire classes of attacks that you can eliminate if you have that mindset and if you have some capacity to defend a runtime in real time.
Well, are we seeing increasing investments in detection and response and runtime protection?
Yes, according to Forrester, the primary investment for application security within the financial sector this year will be runtime protection, which is a shift. Some people have a bad taste in their mouth from the RASP of 10 years ago, but the RASP of today is far more intelligent, and it can effectively allow you to defend against 0 days and entire classes of attacks that will allow for someone to conduct a watering hole, that would allow for someone to island hop through your infrastructure. In addition to that, I just would say we need to appreciate the fact that, in today's world, you can't just trust what's being developed, and you really need to have a higher bar, but the conversation and the culture and the dynamic between the development team and the security team must be improved. It's not their fault. It's not just your prerogative, but I think there's a far too much of over-reliance on either scanning technology or implementation of security solutions like WAFs, which are very limited in their capacity to defend you against the threats we've described.
And we can't, as we've been talking lately, you can't just shift left, push it more onto developers. It's got to span the entire DevOps pipeline. I know that. But
you have to treat each vulnerability as an attack, and you have to have continuous monitoring in the development environment. And I think therein begins progress against what is occurring in the wild.
And you were also talking in the report about ensuring that vendors, holding them up for scrutiny when it comes to ensuring your supply chain security. You did spot a trend where your vendors' security practices, those are being held up for scrutiny by the financial institutions. Is that right?
Yes, particularly system integrators and shared service providers who provide IT services to the entirety of the sector. There's much more scrutiny and there's much more concern about their security posture. But in the same vein, as it relates to the software industry as a whole, you see the mandates coming out of the White House and OMB vis-a-vis attestations to the security of your code, or at least what's in your code. And again, to quote Jeff Williams, you really need to have security in the sunshine here. It's fundamental to our success to understand what's in the code, how that will react with the environment, how that could be exploited, and more importantly, how it could be defended.
And Derek, I want to get your thoughts on the governance and supply chain security issues. This is your chance to speak to what we were chatting about before about your cyber fraud task forces.
Yeah. So, well, we welcome anybody as part of our task force. So if there's small companies or any company out there that wants to be part of it, you're definitely welcome. We hold quarterly meetings, some virtual, some in person, for this very thing, to pass on intelligence like Tom's report, or things that are coming down the pipes from either IC3 or Verizon or Palo Alto, some of our other partners. And it's very important. We had a local case here where an escrow company was contacted by one of their clients. The client told them, hey, wire $750,000 to this bank. And, lo and behold, a couple of days later, the escrow company finds out that the client had been hacked into, and it was a BEC attack. And that $750,000 was gone because enough time had passed. And that's the same thing happens with those vendors, those small companies that are helping and feeding these larger institutions, the larger companies. Anybody's under anybody can be under attack. I fall back to our protection world. If we take the president somewhere and we think it's not safe, or there's somebody there that's not stable, we're going to take him somewhere else. We're going to go through a different route. We're going to ask that person, hey, if they shouldn't be there, tell them to take the day off. Kind of the same thing with vendors and these people. If they're not going to, these other companies, if they're not going to provide the security that they need on their end, then I would stop doing business with them. And I know I'm not an expert in rules and regulations, and I don't want to upset anybody, but that's the way. If I was running a company and somebody's not following those rules, I'm definitely not going to expose my company to somebody else's mistakes.
I'm sorry, Derek, how does this tie into the cyber task force that you guys have got set up?
Sorry, I did get a little off track there. I apologize.
No, you're off track. Tangent.
No, so our cyber fraud task force is here for everybody. It's for law enforcement and private companies as well. And we have banks, we have cyber company, we have network security companies. We have a little bit of all kinds of companies in our task force, and they're around the whole world. It's not just here in Colorado. There's I believe we're up to 45 of them total, including London and Rome. But I believe Angel's going to post in the chat an email. There'll be an email it'll come to me for our cyber fraud task force, but then also a link to our headquarters with some information about how we're broken up around the country. And I strongly invite anybody out there, whether you're a law enforcement officer, but mostly for those companies. And you could be network security, you could be a bank, you could be a bagel shop. It doesn't matter who you are. If you want some good information, good intelligence on what we're seeing in the cyber world, that's what we're there for. We're there and we'll provide awareness, we'll provide training, we'll provide any kind of presentations like this you want us to we'll come to your places of employment. We'll do it for free. We don't charge money. If we get enough from your taxes, we appreciate it. Those are the things that we're here for. We're here to help everybody.
And they'll throw in a free copy of the 2023 Cyber Bank Heist Report. No, I'm counting. It's free for everybody, but you got to go to the site to download it, and that'll be there too, I'm sure, I believe. Well, great. Hey, listeners, if you have any more questions, now's the time to pop them into chat before I let these guys go. But while people may or may not be doing that, let's just talk about, is there anything that we didn't talk about, any best practices for people to take away that we haven't touched on that you'd like to add to the conversation, either of you?
Yeah, I just want to add, specific to the report and the findings and how the offense informs the defense, there are specific, defensive shifts that should be taken. And it begins with, adding a cybersecurity specialist to your board, even if you're not publicly traded. Having that person become the advocate of a CISO that's typically marginalized within your organization would be fundamental to hopefully elevate that person to the position they deserve. Obviously, runtime protection is an imperative. I think XDR platforms are here to stay, the whole extended detection response platforms, or at minimum integrating your NDR with your EDRs. But if you're going to do that, make sure you have a well-trained team on threat hunting. And if they're not well-trained, then hire an MDR firm to do that threat hunting. But the threat hunting should be weekly. It shouldn't just be after an incident. You definitely should micro-segment your networks because you don't want them moving too far laterally once they get in. Deploying application security for serverless environments and serverless platforms is fundamental, as we've spoken to. Using multi-factor authentication coupled with least privilege or just-in-time administration to limit the blast radius of an adversary who has compromised a user would be fundamental. Focus on defending your APIs, understanding how far they go into other organizations and vice versa, and how they could be used to attack your constituency. And then, ensuring code that you develop is continuously tested for vulnerabilities, and make sure that you can prioritize remediation of such.
Excellent. Thank you. Derek, do you want to add anything to that?
Absolutely not. No, Tom's the expert. I'm grateful to be a part of this. I've learned a ton from this. So thank you very much. And appreciate Tom and Contrast for providing great intelligence like this that we'll continue to reference. We'll reference for the next year until the next one comes out.
Oh, that's great to hear. I'm sure Tom loves that. Well, thank you, Derek and Tom. You guys are awesome. Your work is fabulous. We really appreciate all the work that went into this report and the work you do all the time, Derek. I know that anybody who works with the trying to secure the financial sector is going to appreciate your insights. So thank you everyone for hanging out with us and for your excellent questions. If you want follow-up on anything, please do put it into chat and we'll see about getting more answers for you. For now, we hope that you stay safe, stay secure, and have a great day.